She leaned closer, her voice trembling. Age is a problem. I smiled and whispered back, not for me. And that was the moment everything between us changed. It was one of those evenings when the office felt like a different world. Most of the team had gone home hours ago, leaving behind only the steady hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint tapping of rain against the tall glass windows. My desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over the scattered papers, but everything else stretched into shadow. I hadn't realized she was still here. My boss, a woman whose presence always carried a quiet authority, stood at the edge of my desk, folders clutched to her chest like a shield. At 42, she carried herself with the kind of grace that didn't need words to command attention. There was something magnetic about the way she moved, how her eyes lingered when she thought no one noticed, how her silence could speak louder than most people's chatter. She didn't say my name. Instead, her voice slipped into the stillness, low and almost hesitant. Age is a problem. For a second, I wondered if I'd imagined it. The words were so quiet, so carefully exhaled, that they felt less like a statement and more like a secret she hadn't meant to release. The air between us shifted. My pulse jumped, not just because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Her tone wasn't firm, not like the way she usually spoke in meetings. This was softer, more vulnerable, as if she was speaking to herself, and I had simply been close enough to hear. I looked up from my desk, my eyes catching hers in the dim light. For the briefest moment, she didn't look like my boss. She looked like a woman holding back 1,000 things she wasn't sure she should feel. Her perfume lingered faintly, something subtle, elegant, the kind of scent that didn't demand attention but stayed with you long after. The closeness of her voice still buzzed against my ear as though the whisper had weight, settling deep in my chest. I could have stayed silent, could have let the moment pass like a ghost in the late-night office. But something in the way she said it, the fragility behind the words, made silence impossible. I didn't answer yet. Not with words. Instead, I studied her, the tightness in her grip on the folder, the way her shoulders were slightly tense, and the faint crease between her brows. She was a woman used to control, used to never letting anything slip. And yet, just now, something had. That whisper, age is a problem, wasn't just about numbers. It was a confession, a warning, maybe even a plea. And though she didn't know it yet, it was the moment that would change everything between us. For a moment, her words lingered in the air like smoke, fragile and heavy all at once. Age is a problem. I could still hear the tremor in her voice, still feel the weight of what she had let slip. I straightened slightly in my chair, my heart pounding with a rhythm that didn't match the stillness of the office. I wanted to choose my response carefully, but deep down, I knew the truth didn't need polishing. It just needed honesty. Not for me, I said. The words came out steady, not rushed, not careless. They weren't the kind of words you rehearse. They were the kind that rose from somewhere deeper, a place where hesitation had no room. She blinked, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly. It was a tiny flicker of surprise, but it felt monumental, as if I had pulled a thread she had tried to keep tightly knotted. Her lips parted as if she wanted to argue, to remind me of lines that shouldn't be crossed. But instead, she pressed them together again, holding her silence like it was the only thing protecting her. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the faint ticking of the office clock on the wall. I watched her carefully, afraid she might retreat back into the armor she wore so effortlessly during the day. But she didn't. She stayed there, close enough that I could see the way her breath lifted her chest, close enough to notice how her knuckles had turned pale around the folder she was still clutching. Then, slowly, she exhaled. Her grip loosened, the folder lowering just enough for her shoulders to relax. She wasn't conceding, not yet, but she wasn't running either. That tiny surrender felt like a victory I didn't dare celebrate. Her eyes met mine again, and for the first time, I saw something behind the usual authority, a flicker of uncertainty, yes, but also a glimmer of curiosity. She was testing my words, weighing them against all the risks she carried in her mind. I didn't move closer, though I wanted to. I didn't press, though the urge burned through me. Instead, I let the silence speak for us. Because sometimes reassurance isn't about saying more. It's about proving you can stay steady when the ground shifts. And in that moment, with her gaze locked on mine and the world outside the office forgotten, I knew she had heard me. Not just the words, not for me, but the truth beneath them. That I meant every syllable. After that night, nothing was said outright, but something had shifted. It was there in the smallest things, the way she lingered near my desk just a little longer than necessary, the way her eyes found mine in meetings before flicking away just as quickly. The office, once a place of routine and hierarchy, now felt like a place where every glance and every pause carried a secret meaning. I noticed her more, not because I hadn't before, but because now it felt impossible not to. The way she stirred sugar into her coffee, slow and deliberate, her gaze sometimes distant as if lost in thought. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she laughed, her composure cracking for a heartbeat before she pulled herself back into the role everyone expected her to play. Our conversations became longer, though still wrapped in the safety of professionalism. She'd ask about my day, about my projects, and I'd answer, but it was the unspoken current beneath the words that mattered. I learned about her late-night reading habit, about how she preferred quiet mornings over rushed ones, about how she hated the idea of people assuming she had everything figured out. There was one afternoon, sunlight streaming through the blinds and golden stripes across the conference table, when she slid a coffee across to me. Her fingers brushed mine for the briefest second. It was an accident, I told myself. But the warmth of her skin lingered long after the cup was in my hands. I caught her watching me once, just a fleeting glance as I explained something to a colleague. When our eyes met, she looked away so quickly it almost hurt. But the faint flush that colored her cheeks told me it wasn't just my imagination. We were careful. Too careful. Every moment was wrapped in restraint, hidden in plain sight. Yet those small exchanges, the shared elevator rides, the brief walks out of the building, the way our voices softened when we spoke to each other, felt louder than anything we could have admitted out loud. And though neither of us said it, I could feel it building. A rhythm between us, subtle but undeniable. A rhythm that neither rules nor whispers could erase. The closeness between us grew in quiet, almost invisible ways, but just as quickly as it bloomed, I felt her begin to retreat. It was subtle at first, the way she kept her answers shorter, the way her gaze slid past mine instead of lingering. She wasn't cold, not exactly. It was something else. Something heavier. I understood it even before she gave it words. The risk. The weight of what others might think. She was my boss. She was older. She had more to lose. One evening, the office was nearly empty, the kind of quiet where every sound carried. We stepped into the elevator together, the doors closing with a hush that seemed to seal us off from the world. She kept her eyes fixed on the glowing numbers above the doors, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like a glass too full, afraid of spilling over. I shifted slightly, just enough that our shoulders nearly touched. The space was small, too small for the distance she was trying to keep. The hum of the elevator filled the silence, and I could hear her breathing, steady, but not relaxed. I wanted to say something. To tell her she didn't need to fight what we both felt. But the truth was, part of me admired her restraint. It meant this wasn't casual for her. It meant she was protecting something fragile, not just herself, but me too. When the elevator finally chimed and the doors slid open, she walked out quickly, her heels clicking against the marble floor with sharp precision. I stayed back, watching her figure retreat down the corridor. She didn't turn, didn't glance back, but her pace wasn't as steady as she wanted it to be. I stood there, torn between following and letting her go. Every instinct in me wanted to close the distance, to reach out and remind her that she didn't have to bear the hesitation alone. But I didn't. Not yet. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is its own kind of truth, proof that what you're holding back matters too much to risk rushing. And in that silence, I realized something: she wasn't rejecting me. She was fighting herself. Days passed with that unspoken wall between us. She was still kind, still professional, but her warmth had pulled back like the tide, leaving distance where closeness used to live. I told myself I could let it be, that I could accept the silence, the careful avoidance, the way she buried herself in work. But the truth? I couldn't. Not when every glance across the office reminded me of the way her voice had cracked the night she whispered, "Age is a problem." Not when I knew there was more beneath the surface than she allowed herself to admit. That night, it was raining again. The office had thinned out until it was just the two of us, papers scattered across the table, the sound of water tapping insistently against the glass windows. She was standing by the window, her back to me, arms folded as if bracing herself against more than just the storm outside. I rose from my desk, my voice quiet but steady. "You're not afraid of me," I said. "You're afraid people will see what I see in you." She froze. Her reflection in the window shifted, her chin lowering, her shoulders tense. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she turned, her eyes meeting mine. There was no authority there, no practiced distance, only raw fear and something achingly human. "I don't want you to regret me," she whispered. The honesty in her words hit harder than any rejection could have. It wasn't dismissal, it was fear, fear of being too much, or not enough, or of giving me something the world would say I shouldn't want. I stepped closer, careful, slow, as though crossing into fragile ground. "I won't." Her hand brushed against the table's edge, fingertips grazing the polished wood like she needed something to hold on to. And then, almost without realizing, she moved toward me. Just enough that the air between us felt thinner, charged. Her fingers brushed my sleeve, not deliberate, but not entirely accidental either. The rain kept falling outside, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the pounding in my chest. I didn't reach for her, not yet. I only stood there, close enough for her to feel the steadiness in me, close enough for her to see I meant it. And for the first time, she didn't look away. There comes a moment when restraint can no longer hold back the truth. For us, it happened quietly, in a corner of the office that most people never noticed, the small lounge where we sometimes stopped before heading out into the night. The rain had eased, leaving the windows streaked with silver trails. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her posture graceful as always, but her eyes betrayed her. They carried the weariness of someone who had been fighting herself for too long. I sat beside her, leaving just enough space so she wouldn't feel cornered, but close enough that she could feel my presence. For a long while, we didn't speak. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It was alive, charged with everything neither of us dared put into words. Finally, she exhaled, a soft sigh that seemed to unravel something inside her. "You don't know what you're asking for," she murmured, her voice low, almost defeated. I turned slightly, enough for my knee to brush hers. The touch was small, almost accidental, but it sent a ripple through the space between us. "I'm not asking for anything," I replied gently. "I'm just here." Her eyes flickered to mine, a trace of conflict still holding her back. And then, as if she couldn't bear the distance anymore, her hand shifted. Slowly, cautiously, it came to rest on the sofa cushion between us, close, but not quite touching. I let the silence breathe. Then, with deliberate patience, I placed my hand over hers. The warmth of her skin was immediate, seeping through my palm in a way that felt both fragile and unshakable. She didn't pull away. Instead, I felt the faint tremor of her fingers beneath mine, as though her body was betraying the hesitation her mind still clung to. For a moment, neither of us moved. The soft glow from the desk lamps painted the room in golden shadows, wrapping us in a cocoon of stillness. I could feel her pulse, faint but quick, like a secret knocking against her skin. Her shoulders eased, and her gaze softened. She tilted her head just slightly, as though leaning toward something she wasn't ready to name. That simple touch, her hand beneath mine, wasn't grand or dramatic. But it was real. It was the first time she had let herself stay instead of pulling back. And in that fragile closeness, it felt like the world had finally, quietly shifted. The world outside had fallen into its late-night hush, the kind where even the city seemed to breathe softer. Inside the office, the golden lamps cast long shadows, and the storm had passed, leaving the streets below slick with reflected light. We were still sitting close, my hand resting over hers. She hadn't pulled away, and that alone felt like a turning point. Her gaze was lowered, lashes trembling against her cheeks, as if she was listening to some inner voice that still tried to argue with her heart. At last, she spoke, barely louder than a whisper. "Maybe age isn't the problem after all, maybe it's me." The honesty in those words cut through me. She wasn't afraid of my feelings. She was afraid of being the reason I might lose something, afraid of being seen as a mistake in my life. And yet, in that moment, she was more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. I leaned in slightly, careful not to startle her, my voice quiet but steady. "Then let me prove you wrong." Something in her expression softened. It wasn't a smile exactly, not yet. It was more like the beginning of one, hesitant, testing the air, but real. When we finally stood, it wasn't hurried. She gathered her folder slowly, as though reluctant to break whatever had been born in that silence. I slipped on my jacket, and together we walked out into the night. The cool air greeted us, fresh after the rain. Streetlights glowed above us, their light catching the shimmer of wet pavement. Our footsteps echoed in sync, a quiet rhythm that felt like a promise. At one point, her arm brushed against mine. She didn't move away. If anything, she leaned into me, just slightly, but enough for me to feel the warmth of her shoulder against mine. Neither of us said much on that walk, and maybe that was the point. Words weren't necessary anymore. What mattered was that she wasn't running, wasn't hiding, wasn't letting the fear of what others might think decide for her. By the time we reached the corner where our paths would split, she glanced at me. There it was, the smile she had been holding back. Small, uncertain, but full of meaning. And in that moment, I knew, the whisper that once sounded like a problem had become the beginning of something we were finally brave enough to accept.